In the mountains of Puebla, where the wind carries secrets from centuries past, there lies a convent that the Catholic Church has tried to erase from history. For more than 370 years, ecclesiastical authorities have kept in absolute silence what happened during the winter of 1645, when 24 nuns from the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle disappeared under circumstances that defy any rational explanation. The only traces left from that night were bloodstains forming strange symbols on the main altar, a shattered stained glass window depicting the martyrdom of the Christian virgins, and something even more disturbing: the bodies were never found. Yet their voices are still said to echo through the ruins during October storms. Secret documents from the General Archive of the Indies reveal that Pope Innocent X personally ordered all records of the convent to be destroyed, and that anyone who dared to speak of the matter would be excommunicated immediately. What unimaginable horror could have forced the Vatican to try to erase from history an entire religious community? The year was 1598, during the golden age of the viceroyalty of New Spain under the reign of King Philip III. The city of Puebla de Los Angeles had already become one of the most important religious centers of the New World. Its Baroque churches rivaled those of Spain itself, and its convents sheltered the daughters of the colony's most prominent families, young women who sought eternal salvation through a contemplative life. 15 leagues north of the city, in a secret valley surrounded by pine and fir-covered mountains, rose the majestic convent of Santa Lucía del Valle. It was founded by the Order of the Descalced Poor Clares, with an extraordinary endowment provided by Don Hernando de Talavera, one of the richest conquistadors in the region. The convent had been designed as the perfect refuge for divine contemplation. Its architecture was both imposing and unique. Walls of black volcanic stone, extracted from the quarries of Popocatépetl, rose 15 meters into the sky, creating a spiritual fortress that seemed to defy the earthly world. The main bell tower, visible from 5 leagues away, housed 7 bronze bells brought directly from Toledo, each tuned to a different note, creating celestial harmonies during the calls to prayer. The convent's interior gardens were considered a miracle of colonial horticulture. 3 rectangular courtyards, connected by arcaded galleries, bloomed with white Castilian roses, jasmines, azaleas, and a special variety of orchids that grew only in this valley. The nuns believed these flowers were a divine blessing, as they bloomed all year long despite the harsh winter frosts that lashed the region. The religious community was composed of 24 professed sisters, 6 novices, and 3 lay sisters who took on the heaviest tasks. All came from wealthy families of New Spain, daughters of landowners, prosperous merchants, and vice-regal officials, women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to God rather than enter into arranged marriages. The abbess, Mother Superior Esperanza Valdez y Mendoza, had arrived at the convent in 1620 at the age of 18. She came from a Basque family established in Puebla since the earliest years of the conquest. For 25 years she demonstrated exemplary devotion and extraordinary intelligence, which led to her being elected superior in 1640. At 43 years old, Sor Esperanza was respected not only for her theological wisdom but also for her mystical visions, which, according to records of the time, allowed her to predict future events and communicate directly with the saints. The nuns divided their days according to the strict rule of St. Clare. They rose at 4 a.m. for matins, followed by lauds at dawn. After their frugal breakfast, they devoted themselves to copying sacred manuscripts in the scriptorium, a circular hall illuminated by 12 windows that cast light perfectly over the cedar wood lecterns. The sisters had built an exceptional library containing more than 3,000 volumes, writings of the Church Fathers, treatises on mystical theology, and a unique collection of pre-Hispanic codices that missionaries had saved from destruction. The convent's economic sustenance came from 3 main sources: the dowries provided by novices upon professing, the sale of their famous convent suites, shipped monthly to Puebla, Mexico City, and even Veracruz, the income from a cattle ranch bequeathed to the community by Don Hernando de Talavera. The sweets of Santa Lucia were especially coveted: camotes, candied sweet potatoes, cocodas, coconut confections, walnut custard, and a specialty called Tears of the Saint, tiny drops of crystallized sugar infused with orange blossom water, said to have healing properties. Their only regular contacts with the outside world were the mule drivers who transported the sweets each month, the chaplain, Don Sebastián Ruiz de Alarcón, who celebrated Mass 3 times a week, and occasionally the families of benefactors, who came to the convent parlor to request special prayers. The isolation was so complete that many nuns went years without seeing anyone outside the community. The first signs that something extraordinary was happening at the convent of Santa Lucía appeared in August of 1645. Sor Maria del Rosario Alcántara, a 32-year-old nun known for her sensibility and exemplary piety, began experiencing disturbing dreams. In her personal diary, she described them as visions of a blinding light that spoke in unknown tongues. In notes later found hidden in a double bottom of her cell, Sor Maria del Rosario wrote how in these dreams she saw Christ appearing to the Mother Superior during her nightly vigils in the chapel. But this Christ was unlike the one she knew from the scriptures. His eyes were completely black, and he spoke of necessary sacrifices to purify corrupt humanity. The visions became increasingly frequent and intense, to the point that several other sisters began reporting similar experiences. Meanwhile, Sor Esperanza herself began to display subtle yet troubling changes in her behavior. During meals in the refectory, she remained in absolute silence, her gaze fixed on an indefinite point, as if listening to voices only she could hear. The sisters also noticed that she had started spending entire nights in the chapel, kneeling before the high altar, murmuring prayers in a Latin that sounded different from the traditional form. The chaplain, Don Sebastián, also perceived these changes. In a letter dated September 15, 1645, addressed to Bishop Miguel de Poblete y Casa, he expressed his concern. "Your Excellency, I must inform you that the Mother Superior of the Convent of Santa Lucía has begun teaching interpretations of the scriptures that I find peculiar. She speaks of private revelations that do not align with the traditional doctrine of the Church. The sisters seem completely under her influence, and I fear that practices may be developing which could be considered heretical." But the bishop's response never arrived. On September 28, Don Sebastián mysteriously disappeared after celebrating what would be his final Mass at the convent. His horse was found 3 days later grazing freely on the outskirts of Puebla. His body was never recovered. The night of October 23, 1645, began with ominous portents. Villagers from the surrounding areas reported that the convent's bells had rung at 3 a.m., a completely unusual hour for any liturgical call. The sound followed no recognizable pattern. It was a discordant, prolonged tolling that lasted more than an hour, sending eerie echoes through the valley. That same night, Don Aurelio Mendoza y Villarreal, a prosperous silk merchant traveling from Veracruz to the viceregal capital, planned to stop at the convent to purchase sweets, as he often did during his trade routes. Don Aurelio knew the place well. For 15 years, he had maintained commercial relations with the sisters and had even donated money for the restoration of the chapel's main altarpiece. But that night, a storm of extraordinary proportions unleashed itself over the mountains of Puebla. Lightning struck with unusual frequency, illuminating the landscape with flashes that turned the night into a hell of flickering lights and dancing shadows. The wind howled through the pines with such force that centuries-old trunks groaned, and the rain fell with such violence that the roads became impassable. Soaked to the bone and fearing for the safety of his mule train loaded with valuable goods, Don Aurelio spotted the towers of the convent around 11 p.m. But something was terribly wrong. Instead of the faint lights usually seen in the windows during nocturnal vigils, the entire building was submerged in absolute darkness. Not even the eternal lamp of the Blessed Sacrament, which always burned in the chapel, was visible through the stained glass. As he approached the main door, Don Aurelio noticed the silence of the convent. It was unnatural. Even during sleeping hours, some sign of life was always perceptible: the distant murmur of prayers, the creaking of ancient wood, the soft clink of rosaries. But that night, only the roar of the storm broke a silence that seemed supernatural. He struck the heavy oak door with the iron knocker, but no one responded. He shouted for several minutes, identifying himself as a well-known merchant to the sisters, but his voice was lost in the thunder. Truly concerned for the safety of the nuns, he decided to circle the convent in search of the chapel's side entrance, which traditionally remained open to offer refuge to travelers in need. When he pushed open the chapel's side door, Don Aurelio encountered a sight that would haunt every one of his nights for the rest of his life. The interior of the temple was lit only by lightning filtering through the stained glass windows, creating a surreal atmosphere of shifting lights and moving shadows. The great stained glass window depicting the martyrdom of Saint Lucy, a masterpiece of viceregal art worth thousands of gold pesos, was completely shattered. Fragments of colored glass lay scattered across the marble floor like a multicolored carpet of desolation. But what disturbed him most was the pattern they formed. They had not fallen randomly. Instead, they were arranged in concentric circles surrounding the main altar. On the altar, dark stains glistened wet under the lightning, spreading from the tabernacle down to the marble steps. Don Aurelio, who had served as a soldier in his youth and had seen blood many times, recognized the substance immediately. But these stains were not the result of accidental wounds. They formed complex, geometric symbols that seemed deliberately traced. The merchant stood frozen for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. Then he heard something that chilled his blood, feminine voices whispering in Latin. But the words did not match any prayer he knew. The sound seemed to come from the very walls of the convent, as if the stones themselves had absorbed the voices and were slowly releasing them. That same night, Don Aurelio fled the convent, abandoning part of his merchandise in his desperate rush to escape. He rode for hours through the storm, not stopping until he reached the city of Puebla at dawn. His condition upon arrival was deplorable, soaked, trembling, and babbling incoherently about blood and ghostly voices. Bishop Miguel de Poblete y Casa, who had been awaiting news of the missing chaplain, personally received Don Aurelio's testimony. The merchant's words confirmed his worst fears. Something terrible had happened at the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle. The bishop immediately organized an expedition composed of 6 priests, 12 of the viceroy's soldiers, and several civil officials to investigate the situation. The expedition arrived at the convent at midday on October 24th. What they found surpassed the darkest expectations of the bishop. The convent of Santa Lucía del Valle was completely empty, as if its inhabitants had vanished into thin air. The 24 professed nuns, the 6 novices, and the 3 lay sisters had disappeared without leaving any trace of their whereabouts. But the physical absence of the women was only the beginning of the mystery. Each cell preserved all the personal belongings of its occupant, habits folded with the characteristic millimetric precision of convent life, rosaries of mother of pearl and silver laid neatly on night tables, prayer books left open on specific pages as if intentionally chosen. In many cells, the beds were unmade, as though the sisters had been interrupted in their nightly rest. The refectory presented a particularly unsettling scene. The dinner from October 23rd remained intact on the tables, vegetable soup now completely cold, bread still moist from the oven, and jugs of water filled to the brim. The plates were arranged in perfect order, with cutlery placed according to convent etiquette, yet none of it had been touched. In the convent library, the investigators found signs of frantic activity in recent days. Several manuscripts had been violently torn from their shelves and burned in the center of the circular hall, leaving behind a mound of ashes forming a perfect circle almost 2 meters in diameter. Among the legible fragments, the priests of the expedition identified texts not listed in the official catalog of the library, treatises on spiritual purification rituals, direct communion with the divine, and the sacrifices deemed necessary for the elevation of the soul. Before continuing with the story of the vanished sisters, if you enjoy mysteries like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications. Every week we bring you new stories that will leave you breathless. Now, let us return to the convent of Santa Lucía to uncover more secrets the authorities tried to hide. The convent gardens revealed alterations that defied all natural explanation. The white Castilian roses, lovingly cultivated by the nuns for decades, had turned a deep red hue, as though they had been watered with blood for weeks. The valley's unique orchids had completely withered, leaving behind only blackened stems that crumbled at the slightest touch. The 3 wells of the convent, which had always provided crystalline water, even during the most severe droughts, were now completely dry, despite the torrential rains of the previous night that should have filled them to the brim. In the scriptorium, where the nuns had copied sacred manuscripts, the investigators discovered something that filled them with dread. Every text on which the sisters had been working, copies of the Gospels, treatises of the Church Fathers, lives of the saints, had been altered in red ink. The modifications were not random. Someone had systematically replaced key words in the sacred texts, transforming messages of love and salvation into invocations of bloody sacrifices and carnal communion with the divine. Bishop Puebla immediately ordered all the altered manuscripts to be confiscated under armed guard and sent to the secret archives of the Archdiocese of Mexico. At the same time, he decreed that the entire case be classified as a matter of faith and placed under the strictest pontifical secrecy. Anyone who revealed information about what had happened at the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle would be excommunicated immediately and handed over to the Inquisition. That same week, the official records were altered. In the diocesan archives, the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle was now listed as closed for pastoral needs, and its nuns as transferred to other houses of the order by superior disposition. All documents referring specifically to the community were removed, burned, or sent to secret archives in Spain. 93 years after the disappearance, in the autumn of 1738, a young Jesuit priest named Father Tomás Guerrero y Espinosa was sent from the Colegio de San Pedro y San Pablo in Mexico City to carry out a thorough inventory of abandoned ecclesiastical properties in the Puebla region. Father Guerrero, just 28 years old, had been chosen for this task because of his reputation as a meticulous investigator and his exceptional knowledge of Latin, Nahuatl, and several indigenous dialects of the region. During his systematic review of diocesan archives, he began to find confusing and contradictory references to the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle in documents that had somehow escaped the purge ordered by Bishop Puebla nearly a century earlier. These references appeared in tithe inventories, lists of benefactors, episcopal correspondence, and death records, but always in a fragmentary and incomplete manner. Intrigued by the lack of coherent information about a convent that clearly had existed and had been important enough to appear in multiple documents, Father Guerrero decided to dig deeper. He consulted parish archives of nearby towns, interviewed local elders whose grandparents might have known of the convent, and studied old maps that showed its exact location. One elderly man, Don Patricio Medina, 97 years old and the grandson of one of the mule drivers who once carried the convent suites, gave him the first concrete clue. Don Patricio vividly remembered the stories his grandfather told him about the convent, where the sisters flew to heaven one stormy night. According to these family tales, his grandfather had been one of the last visitors to the convent before the disappearance and had insisted until his death that something diabolical had taken hold of the holy women. Armed with these geographical hints and fragmentary testimonies, Father Guerrero set out for the valley where the convent's ruins supposedly lay. The path had been erased by decades of neglect, but by following the topographical descriptions in the old documents, he managed to locate the site after 3 days of searching. The ruins of the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle rose ghostly against the gray autumn sky of Puebla. 93 years of abandonment had covered the volcanic stone walls with thick layers of ivy and moss, yet the main structure remained surprisingly intact. The bell tower still stood imposingly, although 3 of its 7 bells had fallen and lay fractured in the main courtyard. Exploring the interior, Father Guerrero was struck by how well preserved many areas were. The frescoes in the galleries were still partially visible, showing scenes from the life of Saint Clare and other saints of the order. The gardens, though completely overgrown, retained traces of their original design, and some roses had survived, though now with strange shapes and colors ranging from their original white to a deep, blood red. It was in the circular library that Father Guerrero made his first significant discovery. Among the debris of collapsed shelves and manuscripts destroyed by moisture and time, he found a cedar chest hidden beneath the remains of a fallen beam. Inside were documents that had escaped both the original confiscation and the ravages of time. The manuscripts, written in several different hands, all dated to the period immediately before the disappearance. The most revealing was the personal diary of Sor Maria del Rosario Alcantara, the same nun who had begun experiencing disturbing visions in August of 1645. Her pages, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, documented in chilling detail the gradual transformation of the community under the influence of Sor Esperanza. As the mystery of the convent of Santa Lucia deepened, what do you think Father Guerrero would discover in those secret documents? The diary of Sor Maria del Rosario revealed a terrifying progression of events that had begun months before the final disappearance. Her earliest entries, dated May of 1645, described the visions of the Mother Superior as heavenly encounters in which Christ revealed hidden truths about the nature of salvation. But as the months passed, the descriptions grew increasingly disturbing. Sor Esperanza had begun teaching that salvation did not come through prayer and penance, but through an act of total surrender that required the physical sacrifice of the entire community. On July 15, 1645, Sor Maria del Rosario wrote, "Our Mother tells us that Christ Himself has revealed to her the final secret of redemption. According to her visions, we, the chosen ones of this community, must literally become the body of Christ. Not symbolically, as in the Eucharist, but by fusing our souls and our bodies with divinity through a ritual she has learned by direct revelation." The diary revealed that not all the nuns had immediately accepted these new teachings. Sor Carmen Morales, a 25-year-old nun from a family of theologians in Salamanca, was the first to publicly express doubts about Sor Esperanza's interpretations. In an entry dated August 22, Sor Maria del Rosario wrote, "Sor Carmen has once again been taken to the crypt for a session of illumination. It is the third time this week. When she returns, her eyes have a glassy expression, and she mutters prayers in a language I do not recognize. I fear for her soul, but I also fear contradicting our Mother, who assures us these practices are divine will." Father Guerrero found physical evidence of these illumination sessions when he decided to explore the underground areas of the convent. Using an improvised torch and following the references in the diary, he located the entrance to a crypt hidden behind the main altar of the chapel, concealed by a marble slab that slid aside when a specific sequence of decorative reliefs was pressed. The subterranean crypt extended far beyond what the visible architecture of the convent suggested. A network of passages carved directly into the volcanic rock led to several chambers of different sizes, all illuminated by strategically placed openings that allowed natural light to enter during certain hours of the day. In the main chamber, Father Guerrero made a discovery that would forever change his understanding of what had occurred in 1645. 24 skeletons dressed in monastic habits lay arranged in a perfect circle around a black stone altar that clearly did not belong to Christian architecture. The bones bore signs of having been carefully positioned in specific ways, the hands clasped in prayer, the faces turned toward the central altar. But what was most disturbing was not the human remains. It was what was inscribed on the walls of the chamber. Every surface was covered in texts in Latin, mixed with symbols that seemed to predate Christianity. The inscriptions had been carved with primitive tools directly into the rock, and many were stained with a dark substance that time had hardened into a shiny crust. Father Guerrero spent days transcribing and translating the inscriptions. What he discovered filled him with a horror that went beyond the physical. The texts were not random heresies. They were a meticulous and orderly record of what Sor Esperanza had called the Great Communion. The inscriptions described a gradual process by which the Mother Superior had convinced the entire community that eternal salvation could only be reached through a collective sacrifice that would transform them into a single divine entity. On one of the side walls, written in the unmistakable handwriting of Sor Esperanza, Father Guerrero found what appeared to be a detailed manual of the final ritual. The text began with a theological justification. If Christ sacrificed himself to redeem humanity, we, his chosen brides, must sacrifice ourselves to redeem Christ himself, liberating him from the burden of carrying the world's sins. The twisted logic revealed a mind that had crossed the border between mystical devotion and utter madness. Esperanza had come to believe that Christ suffered eternally for the sins of mankind, and that only a collective act of sacrifice by truly pure souls could free him from that perpetual agony. The inscriptions also detailed the preparation process, which had lasted for months. The illumination sessions in the crypt had in fact been indoctrination rituals in which Sor Esperanza employed a combination of extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and hallucinogenic substances extracted from local mushrooms to break the psychological resistance of the sisters who opposed her teachings. Just when it seemed everything had been uncovered, the horror of Santa Lucia deepened further. According to the texts, the black stone altar had appeared in the crypt during the summer of 1645, shortly after Sor Esperanza began experiencing her most intense visions. She claimed the altar had been sent by divine revelation after a particularly intense night of prayer. Descriptions suggested that the monolith had been excavated somewhere in the surrounding mountains and secretly transported into the convent during the night. From his limited knowledge, Father Guerrero concluded that the altar's black stone was not volcanic like the rest of the convent's construction. Instead, it appeared to be pure obsidian of extraordinary size. Its surface was covered with engravings that combined distorted Christian symbols with others resembling pre-Hispanic codices that he had studied during his Jesuit training. At the exact center of the altar, carved with precision that suggested the use of specialized tools, was a Latin inscription that froze the young priest's blood. Hic est corpus meum quod vobis traditor in aeternum. This is my body, which shall be given up for you for eternity. The words were written in the perfect calligraphy of Sor Esperanza. Around this main text, in much smaller letters, appeared a repeated phrase in Nahuatl, which Father Guerrero managed to translate. Where the blood meets the sacred stone, the worlds become one. This fusion of tradition suggested that Sor Esperanza had incorporated elements of local pre-Hispanic beliefs into her distorted theological system. Father Guerrero remembered reading about ancient Aztec sacrificial rituals carried out on obsidian altars. He began to suspect that the Mother Superior had gained access to forbidden knowledge the first missionaries had tried to eradicate completely. Among the documents inside the cedar chest, Father Guerrero also discovered letters that revealed Sor Esperanza had maintained secret correspondence with Friar Bernardino de Sahagun the Younger, nephew of the famous chronicler, who had secretly continued his uncle's research on pre-Hispanic religions. These letters, dated between 1643 and 1645, showed that the friar had provided the Mother Superior with translations of Nahuatl texts describing rituals of divine transformation through collective sacrifice. The most revealing and disturbing document Father Guerrero found was a 43-page manuscript written entirely by Sor Esperanza during the weeks leading up to the disappearance. It was titled, The Book of the Great Final Communion. The text described, in chilling detail, the planning and execution of the ritual that had destroyed the entire community. It began with a theological justification that revealed the complete collapse of the Mother Superior's mind. For 25 years I have served Christ in this sacred valley, but only now do I understand the true nature of his suffering. He did not die only once upon the cross to redeem us. He dies each day, each hour, each moment, carrying the weight of our sins renewed. His agony is eternal, and only we, his purest brides, can free him of this burden through the ultimate sacrifice that will make us one flesh with his divinity. The manuscript continued, explaining how Esperanza had interpreted her visions as direct mandates from Christ to organize what she called the final marriage between the human and the divine. In her distorted logic, the 24 nuns of the convent represented the 24 hours of the day, and their simultaneous sacrifice would create an eternal cycle of redemption, liberating Christ from his perpetual suffering. The central pages of the manuscript detailed the meticulous preparations for the night of October 23rd. Sor Esperanza had chosen the date because it corresponded to the feast of St. John of Capistrano, and because certain astronomical alignments, learned from the pre-Hispanic texts, would, in her eyes, open a gateway between the earthly and celestial worlds. In the weeks before the ritual, she carefully prepared every detail. She mixed hallucinogenic substances extracted from sacred mushrooms into the sacramental wine, ensuring that the sisters would enter an altered state of consciousness and be more receptive to her final instructions. She altered traditional prayers by inserting Nahuatl invocations that, according to her belief, would open spiritual portals. The manuscript also revealed the fate of chaplain Don Sebastian. He had discovered the preparations for the ritual and tried to stop Sor Esperanza. The confrontation took place on September 28, when he found the obsidian altar in the crypt and realized the heretical nature of her actions. Esperanza resolved the problem directly and brutally. She poisoned the sacramental wine with a lethal dose of tolochi extract, ensuring the chaplain's death before he could alert the authorities. His body had been hidden in a side chamber of the crypt, where Father Guerrero would later find it almost a century afterward, mummified by the peculiar humidity and temperature of the underground chamber, still wearing remnants of his priestly garments and clutching a silver crucifix that identified him as Don Sebastian. The description of the final ritual filled the last 10 pages of the manuscript, written in handwriting increasingly erratic, reflecting the progressive collapse of Sor Esperanza's mind. On the night of October 23, during the raging storm, the Mother Superior gathered all the sisters in the crypt after dinner. Under the influence of the hallucinogenic substances, they obediently followed her instructions as she led them in a ritual procession around the obsidian altar. According to her account, each nun willingly took part in the rite, convinced that she was performing the holiest act possible. One by one, the sisters placed themselves in specific positions around the altar, reciting altered prayers that blended Christian Latin with Nahuatl invocations. Esperanza believed with absolute certainty that she was guiding them through a mystical transformation that would fuse the entire community into a single divine entity. But the truth was far darker. In a state of religious delirium, fueled by years of isolation, harsh ascetic practices, and possible mental illness, Sor Esperanza had orchestrated the systematic murder of her entire community. The supposed spiritual transformations described in her manuscript were, in reality, deaths caused by a mixture of local plant-based poisons and ritual suffocation. The manuscript ended with Sor Esperanza's final words, written while the other sisters already lay lifeless around the altar. The work is complete. We have transcended the limits of corrupt flesh and joined forever with divinity. Christ has been freed from his agony, and we have attained eternal perfection. Soon I shall join my sisters in infinite glory, and together we shall be one body with our heavenly spouse for all eternity. The last entry, almost illegible because of her trembling hand, revealed a final moment of lucidity. My God, what have I done? I see them, my sisters, dead, all dead because of me. It was not Christ who spoke to me, it was my own madness. O Lord, forgive me. I have destroyed the purest souls. I have turned this sacred place into. The phrase remained unfinished. Sor Esperanza had taken the same poison she had administered to her sisters, but the dose was insufficient to kill her immediately. In her final moments of life, she realized the true nature of her actions, but it was far too late for any earthly redemption. Father Guerrero remained within the ruins of the convent for 3 full days, meticulously documenting every detail of his discovery while wrestling with the overwhelming decision of what to do with the truth he had unearthed. The story of the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle was infinitely more terrible than even the darkest speculations he had imagined. It represented one of the most disturbing episodes of religious fanaticism in the history of New Spain. Esperanza Valdez y Mendoza, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to the service of God, had been gradually consumed by a mystical obsession that drove her to commit the gravest sin imaginable, the murder of 23 innocent souls who had trusted completely in her spiritual leadership. With his knowledge of theology and natural philosophy, Father Guerrero, in retrospect, concluded that Sor Esperanza had suffered from what modern medicine would call severe religious psychosis, likely worsened by extreme isolation, rigorous ascetic practices, and the regular use of hallucinogenic substances. Her access to pre-Hispanic texts on sacrificial rituals had given her delusions a conceptual framework, transforming mental illness into a tragedy of monumental proportions. Yet there were aspects of the case that transcended psychological explanation alone. The precision with which Sor Esperanza had planned and executed the ritual. The sophistication of her distorted theological system. The ease with which she manipulated an entire community of educated and intelligent women. All of this suggested a form of evil made even more terrible because it disguised itself as supreme virtue. For Father Guerrero, the implications for the Catholic Church were equally devastating. The tragedy had not occurred in spite of the religious structure but within it, perpetrated by a respected authority figure who had been revered by her community. And the fact that the episcopal hierarchy had chosen to completely cover up the case, rather than expose it as a warning against religious fanaticism, revealed an institution more concerned with its reputation than with the truth. After a painful inner struggle, Father Guerrero made a decision that would change the course of his own life. He resealed the crypt. He returned all the documents to their original place. And he swore solemnly never to reveal what he had discovered. In his official report to the Archbishop of Mexico, he wrote only that the ruins in the valley had no significant historical or spiritual value and recommended that they be permanently ignored. The documents of his investigation were stored in the deepest vaults of the archbishopric, with explicit instructions that they remain sealed for at least 200 years. But the weight of truth changed him forever. He abandoned his academic vocation and requested assignment as a missionary in the most remote regions of New Spain, where he spent the rest of his life working with indigenous communities, attempting to atone, through good works, for the unbearable burden of carrying such a terrible secret. But the story of the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle did not end with Father Guerrero's silence. Over the following centuries, the valley continued to attract visitors who reported inexplicable phenomena. During the October storms, especially near the anniversary of the tragedy, multiple witnesses claimed to hear female voices singing in Latin, as if the souls of the nuns remained trapped in the place of their death. Modern investigators who studied the case from psychological and sociological perspectives identified several factors that contributed to the tragedy. The community's extreme isolation, the absolute authority of the Mother Superior, the lack of effective external supervision, and the religious culture of the 17th century, which valued mystical visions without critical questioning. The case has since become a study on the dangers of religious fundamentalism and the importance of maintaining structures of accountability and oversight in spiritual institutions. Some historians have even suggested that the tragedy of Santa Lucía del Valle was one of the factors that pushed the Catholic Church to establish stricter protocols for evaluating mystical visions and for supervising enclosed religious communities. The reforms of the late 17th century included more frequent episcopal visits, mandatory rotation of convent authorities, and the prohibition of altering liturgical texts without explicit authorization from Rome. In 1847, the valley where the convent once stood was acquired by the Mexican government, and in 1923 it was declared a protected natural area. The ruins of the convent were stabilized to prevent total collapse, but public access to the site was forbidden. A small commemorative plaque, placed in 1975, bears only these words: "In memory of the Sisters of the Convent of Santa Lucía del Valle, 1598 to 1645. May their souls rest in the peace they did not find in life." This mystery reminds us that faith, when separated from reason, compassion, and communal oversight, can become the instrument of unimaginable tragedies. The story of the convent of Santa Lucía del Valle is an eternal reminder that the pursuit of spiritual perfection, when taken to extremes without the moderation of human wisdom, can lead us down paths that carry us far from the very divinity we believe we serve. The 24 women who perished in that crypt were not villains, but victims of a system that allowed a religious authority to act without question, until devotion was transformed into homicidal madness.